Hello, everyone. This is the first lecture on the Progressive Era, and I have a couple apologies to make. The first is that I recorded both Progressive Era lectures on Wednesday, and then it turned out that I didn't record them because I hadn't pushed the record button, which was very frustrating, and then I had meetings all day yesterday. So this is going out early Friday morning, and I'm really sorry about that. I'm going to probably adjust the deadline on your assignment number 2 in order to reflect the fact that this is late. The second thing is every power tool known to humankind is being employed in my neighborhood while I'm recording this, so please excuse the weed whackers, the lawnmowers, the drills, the whatever you hear in the background, because there are all sorts of changes going on in my neighborhood, and there's no other way to record this since I don't have a recording studio that's completely soundproof. But anyways, that's a long way of going about saying that I haven't made much progress, on this module, and that the noise pollution might be one of the things that the muckrakers would deal with. And I'll explain what muckrakers are in a minute. Now, let me explain why I chose these two photographs as the main slides for the Progressive Era lectures. Okay, on the left you have Teddy Roosevelt dealing with something called the meat scandal. The meat scandal, well, I'll get to in a little while, but was something that the progressives really railed against and tried to, because adulterated meat, spoiled meat, rotten meat was being sold to consumers, some of it even canned and sold to consumers, and that was considered not only wrong but a major health problem, but it required the government to get involved in the regulation of business, right? And so this was seen as very, in many cases, un-American, and so that was a difficult thing for progressives to get accomplished. And finally, when Teddy Roosevelt got involved, important acts were passed, and I'll talk about them in 1906. I'll talk about them in a minute. The other reason I like to show this picture is because, and I'm sorry that the resolution isn't great, but it's a political cartoon from the time. The other reason I like this is because it shows muckraking. Okay? And muckraking, it was a term applied to journalists who, in the Progressive Era, raked up the muck of society. In other words, they exposed the corruption, they exposed things like filth in the meat industry, they exposed other wrongdoings, and they were criticized for raking up muck. But they took it on as a badge of honor because they were showing the rest of the country what was going on. So being a muckraker was both an insult and a badge of honor in the period. And that's what you see. That's purposely why this cartoonist, or at least I think it's purposely why this cartoonist chose to have a rake, and Teddy Roosevelt raking up this meat scandal that's been, people have tried to cover up, and he's exposing the horrors of it. So in one cartoon, it shows a lot. It shows Roosevelt finally getting involved in this thing, Congress in the back, which seems to be empty and not doing anything, and then raking up the actual muck and exposing it to public scrutiny. And on the right is a picture of women suffragists, who we'll talk about more in the next lecture, second lecture, because they are. That's what the second lecture is going to be. Start off at least with feminism and with the battle for the 21st Amendment. And this is one of the very common things you see in this period, is women protesting directly outside the White House. So these are people protesting, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Meaning, how long must women wait in order to get the vote and become true American citizens? And this is recognized as American citizens by the government. This is a very common image of the period. You see, if you Google suffragist protests or even suffragette protests, you'll find a lot of these pictures. Be careful when you do that. Obviously, there are a lot of suffrage movements in the world. You might very well pick up a Canadian picture or a British picture. So I always be careful to make sure when you're analyzing this kind of document, you're analyzing something from the American period. So anyway, I like these two pictures because they juxtapose two of the biggest issues of this era and why it was called the progressive, or it became to be called the progressive era. So what I'd really like to do today is, what I'd really like to do over both lectures is talk about the progressive era as an urban age and a consumer society, and I'll talk about the complications of that. There were lots of varieties of progressivism, right? It's not just all one thing. And the ways in which progressivism was attempted to be implemented in politics and through the government is very, very important. And then, of course, there were a series of what were called progressive presidents at the time, and that itself is a very, very interesting term applied later to presidents by historians to explain how many of them came to view progressivism as the wave of the future. Now, before we go any further, I really need to stress that, like so many words in American history, democracy, republicanism, Democrat, Republican, progressive, conservative, these words are being used in contemporary American politics, that is politics now in the 21st century, and they're being used in, frankly, an incorrect way. They're being applied to certain social movements or political movements where they don't really belong. So try not to think, when you're reading about progressivism, try not to think of the way, for instance, the American left right now is criticized for being progressive, or in fact champions itself as being progressive, because it's much more complicated than that, and it was more complicated than that certainly in the progressive era. Okay, I could go on at length about the use and misuse of political sciencey terms in American history, but I don't want to bore you to death with that this lecture. So let me start with, I want to start with an image, and this is called Movie 5 Cents. It's a painting by John Sloan, very famous artist at the time. And he showing the interior of a movie house. This is 1907. Okay. By 1907, millions of people were flocking to movie theaters, cinemas to see silent motion pictures. And you can see in the upper left there the screen showing the picture. The screens were very small. The movies were obviously silent movies. They were black and white, and usually the theaters are small because the pictures were so small. Okay, now there are many interesting things about this painting. Of course, it's common for artists to pick one the people in a painting, in a group painting, to be looking directly at the artist, directly at the viewer, I should say. And you see that right smack dab in the center of the picture. But here we see an audience that includes different classes of people well off, people not well off, different races, right? Couples attending, and also single women attending alone. So this shows a remarkably diverse scene at a movie theater. And there were commentators at the time who thought that the movies, unlike so much the theater, the sort of highbrow theater, was representing a breakdown of social or a loosening of social restrictions on different types of people. Right? It was not seen as déclassé to go to a movie and be sitting with people of other classes, other races, or to go to a movie as a single woman. This became something acceptable during this period, and that's a brand new thing. So I like this as an encapsulation of the sort of social change and cultural change that happens in the progressive era. Now, first off, the city as an entity is really important in the progressive era. Okay, during this period, the economy grew enormously. Right? Industrial production increased, population boomed, the consumer marketplace expanded, but what the difference is this was the last time in American history that farms and cities grew together, and by growing together, I mean grew at a sort of similar rate. Okay, agriculture was entering its golden age, right? What historians call the golden age, partly because of the mechanization and the industrialization of agricultural production, but also because growing cities growing a population by leaps and bounds demanded a lot more agricultural products to be shipped in. So in addition to populations, to urban populations growing, farm families had to move. A lot of farm families moved west and poured into the Great Plains states in order to find more and more land. Okay, let me give you a couple of stats. Between 1900 and 1910, the combined population of Texas and Oklahoma increased by nearly 2 million people. Okay, Texas and Oklahoma, 2 million people, and even in the far more sparsely populated states, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, that increased by 800,000 people in 10 years. Okay, this is 10 years. These are enormous jumps. Okay? And another thing that happens is, I don't know the acreage on this, but I should know the acreage on it. Major areas of commercial farming erupted in Arizona and in California because of advances in irrigation, because of advances in moving water long distances. Okay, this was a big change and made the San Fernando Valley green and increased crop production enormously. Okay, so again, this is all part of the industrialization of agriculture, which helped increase production and increase output. Right, but overall, the city, urban life, that was the focus of the progressive era, the focus of progressive politics, and the focus of a new mass consumer society. And I'll show a few illustrations of that in a minute. The number of cities in the United States with a population of more than 100,000 grew. Okay, now New York obviously was the largest, 4.7 million people, right? But other cities expanded tremendously, and particularly when immigrants came in, and I'll explain this more in a minute. They initially came in from Europe through Boston and New York, and well, now in the progressive era, they come in through Boston and New York mainly, but they move. A lot of them move immediately west, right, to places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Chicago. Okay. What happens though is that the inequalities in urban life that people had seen in the 1890s continued. Okay, immigrants and working people living in slums, right, and very wealthy people living in relatively isolated neighborhoods with luxurious mansions. And I'm not talking about living out in the Hamptons, or although people did do that, and I'm talking about living in New Rochelle or anything like that. I'm talking about sort of islands if you take the island of Manhattan, islands within the island of Manhattan, of very, very wealthy people who were able to own so much land that they could have essentially gardens or yards or small estates in Manhattan. And if the Manhattan real estate prices were, sky high back then too. In order to have that kind of money, you really had to be very, very well heeled. So Manhattan is one of these places that really shows the vast differences between the way people lived in the United States. Okay, and places like Brooklyn and Queens and things were sort of seen as middle class refuges from the squalor of like the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So when you saved up a little bit of money, you moved out to Brooklyn or you moved out to Queens in order to get a house rather than living in a tenement, and to have slightly more space. So this is very, very important. Again, Manhattan is sort of seen as a very important, very illustrative case study in progressive era life. The other thing that happens, and relates to the cities directly, is the growth of the finance industry. Okay, remember when we talked about industrial life, industrial revolution, we talked about oil, we talked about steel, we talked about railroads, talked about a lot of different things, but the trade in money, or the actual trade in money, trade in currency, the trade in finance as a commodity on its own, really sort of took off at the end of the 1890s and the early 20th century. Okay, for instance, and these enormous financial firms grew up and competed with the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts for in the wealth stakes. J.P. Morgan, for instance, okay, his financial firm in New York, directly or indirectly, controlled 40% of all financial and industrial capital in the nation. Okay, 40%, one firm. And at the same time, again, this is the same sort of thing. The mirror image of that is, more than a third of American workers lived in poverty at the same time. Okay, so you have in Manhattan, in Wall Street, these financial firms who were enormously wealthy, and then Lower East Side, which is very close to Wall Street, is a slum. Okay. Now, but the other thing about cities, though, is they're very dynamic, and they were constantly changing, and they're seen as sort of laboratories of modernity. All kinds of new things are being tried there. So the cities attract writers and artists, right, who capture this dynamism, capture this modernity, capture these changes. That's like I showed you the movie house picture, and we'll see more of that in a minute. Now, other cities, right? I shouldn't just talk about New York. This is important, especially for us here in Pittsburgh and in what was known as the West, were seen as places where corporate greed eroded traditional values. And I'm sort of getting into this muckraking thing. Okay, there was a new generation of journalists who were writing for mass circulation national magazines, usually weekly magazines, that expose the problems of industrial life, expose the problems of urban existence, slum existence. Okay, for instance, a journalist named Lincoln Steffens wrote a series for McClure's magazine. McClure's was a very, very widely read magazine in this period. I think McClure's may still be going, but now it's sort of a grocery store checkout magazine with recipes and stuff in it like that, and celebrity stuff. But I could be wrong. It was certainly still going in the 80s and 90s. Anyway, Lincoln Steffens writes this series called The Shame of the Cities. And what he does is he showed how party bosses and businessmen profited from political corruption within the urban political environment. Okay? And in the same magazine, McClure's, Ida Tarbell, another muckraker, pointed out, there was a great deal of arrogance and the economic machinations, the sort of shady dealings, and the sort of old boy network of Ida Tarbell specifically went after John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Right? Now, initially, Teddy Roosevelt, who we saw at the very beginning of the lecture, raking up muck over the meat scandal, criticized this kind of journalism, calling it muckraking. It's the first time that phrase was used. Right. The idea is that you're raking over the muck, raking over the filth of American society, of industrial society, and you're exposing it to the public. But really, all you're doing is you're just scandal mongering, right, and showing the worst side of American life and not showing the positive sides of American life. Well, as it turned out, the muckraking journalists sort of, as I may have hinted at the beginning, took this on as a badge of honor. Yeah, so we are the muckrakers. We are showing the underside. We are showing the problems with American life, the corruption, food adulteration, terrible working conditions, especially for factory workers, right? And by the way, one of the most important muckrakers, one of the most important people in American history in this period was a woman named Nellie Bly, who was from Pittsburgh and was a muckraker and a sort of and also an adventure journalist. Long story, but if you ever, any of you ever want to have a paper topic about somebody really interesting, Nellie Bly is fantastic. So look her up. Okay, so muckraking became this process of exposing the underside of American life for good and for evil, right? Trying to show what was wrong and which mobilized a lot of people to help change it, but also a lot of people complained that it was excessively negative. On the higher level of literary work, if you will, novelists wrote similar works of similarly critical works of fiction. Okay, for instance, Upton Sinclair, very famous novelist, wrote a book called The Jungle. And The Jungle had in it, within the plot, descriptions of slaughterhouses and rotten meat, very unsanitary slaughterhouse, very unsanitary, and rotten meat, and all the things that you saw in that Teddy Roosevelt cartoon with the meat scandal, right? And it really, well, not to be too crude about it, it grossed people out. And doctors and public health officials were saying, this is a terrible health crisis for the United States. You can't, not only is it immoral to give people this adulterated food and this rotten food, we have this bright, shiny new industrial society. How can we expect workers and families to be healthy enough to thrive and make that society work if they're not fed healthy food? Okay, and so the Jungle plus other muckraking, journalistic muckraking, and other muckraking led directly to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug and Pure Food and Drug Acts and the Meat Inspection Acts of 1906. Okay, these were a series of acts that banned an awful lot of these unsanitary practices and drastically improved the quality of American diets, and made it actually a federal crime to adulterate meat and to sell adulterated meat. Okay. So that's kind of one of the major early progressive era achievements. Right? Now let me show you some pictures. I talked about urban life on and on, over and over again, and this is a colorized photograph from around 1900 showing the teeming street life in Mulberry Street, which is on New York City's densely populated Lower East Side of Manhattan. Mulberry Street was very famous for being so teeming and so densely populated. Even well into the later decades of the 20th century, Dr. Seuss, in fact, wrote a book called "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street." I think it's one of his first books. And in it, he says, I saw an elephant. I saw all kinds of wildly different things going down Mulberry Street. And the reason he did it in a very Dr. Seussian way, the rhymes and all that stuff and funny characters. But the whole point was that Mulberry Street had an immense number of things going on at the time. And here it was in the middle of the city, and he's seeing a Bengal tiger being moved from one part of the city up to the zoo, and then he's seeing, a family shopping for curtains or whatever. So the whole diversity, the whole range of urban life in America was sort of encapsulated in depictions of Mulberry Street. Now, what this photograph shows, and remember, this is a colorized photograph. It's a black and white photograph initially, but it was colorized by later experts who do this. And I particularly chose this colorized version because this is a colorization artist that I know is very sensitive to the tone, to make it as accurate as possible to the colors and tones of the time. In other words, not just turning it into a Hollywood scene. But remember, this is black and white. So this color photography did not exist at the time, and it's very, very important not to confuse those things. So this is purposely colored, but it's purposely colored so you can see a lot of the contrasts and bring out a little bit more of of the life in that. And what this is showing is how incredibly dense and teeming the street life in Mulberry Street was. Okay, largely brought about because of immigration in the early 20th century. Okay, and I will talk more about that in a minute. And the fact that these people are so crammed in, and Mulberry Street seems to be wall-to-wall people and wall-to-wall tenements, helped spark a lot of the reforms pushed by the progressives in the progressive movement. Okay, to many people, it seemed almost un-American to pack people in like sardines in a city. This is something that, many Americans thought people were leaving Europe, the teeming cities of Europe and the factory cities of Europe, to come to America and work on the farm and be cowboys and things like that. And here they were living the same exact life. So progressives looked at this kind of picture and said, look, we have horses in here. They're dropping horse droppings everywhere. People mingling all over. Some of these food vendors are selling good food. Some of them are selling adulterated food. Whatever. It's an unclean. It's an unsanitary environment. Another, for those movie buffs out there, another example of this, another good example, frankly, and I usually never say that about the movies, is The Godfather Part 2. The scenes in The Godfather Part 2 that show the young Vito Corleone, meaning the young Vito Corleone as a young man starting his life, show these exact kinds of scenes. And I'm pretty sure that Francis Ford Coppola, the director of The Godfather, looked at these actual kind of pictures from 1900 in order to determine what life was like, or certainly his set directors and people like that. But it's a very good depiction. So if you ever want to see, if you ever watch Godfather 2, you should watch Godfather 2 for all kinds of reasons, but that's one reason for the progressive era. Anyway, okay, this other picture I want to show is the Bowery at night. And again, this is all part of the, this is the urban. This is the aspect of progressive of the era that really shows urban life. This is a painting by William Sontag. Right, it's another early 20th century painter. He's fascinated by the scenes of urban life. So in the Bowery at night, he depicts a boisterous New York City street scene, which has streetcars. Now, you may have to zoom in to see this detail, but the streetcars are there. Private carriages, right? Crowds of people making their way on the sidewalk, and an elevated railway. Okay? So again, you're getting a sort of a crammed in aspect of city life. It all depicted in one painting. But the other thing about this one that's different from the Mulberry Street picture, of course, first of all, it's at night. But second of all, you see these crowds of people on the sidewalk, and you see all these illuminated shop windows. Hey, this was a very interesting innovation in this period. It takes off in the first 50 years of American life, and that is the development of shop windows as entertainment. Right, people used to go downtown to look at the shop windows. Right, ask your grandparents or your great grandparents if they used to go down to Kaufman's and downtown to Gimbel's and stuff to look at the shop windows, at the displays of all the goods available there. And that's sort of what you're seeing here along this arcade that's underneath the elevated railroad. These are all shop windows. There's probably a cinema in among them. There's probably a tavern. There's probably a dancing hall, right? So again, the idea that city life is teeming, the idea that city life is dynamic, is all part of this Bowery at night image. Okay, I've been referring sort of obliquely to immigration in the early 20th century in this period, and I should address it more completely. Perhaps the most characteristic aspect of early 20th century cities was the presence of immigrants. Now, this is very important, though, to talk about the distinction between the first major wave of modern immigration in the United States, which happened in the 1880s and 1890s, and then the second wave. Okay, the one in the 1880s and 90s was largely people from northwestern Europe, Britain, Ireland, Germany, France, places like that. Between 1901 and 1904, we have this period, what we call the new immigration. And the new immigration was overwhelmingly from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this new immigration reaches its peak in the Progressive Era. Okay. Again, let me give you some more stats. Between 1901 and 1914, about 13 million immigrants came to the United States. Now, most of them from Italy, from Russia, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and southeastern Europe. Okay, places where immigrants largely hadn't come from before, and this was part of a global process of immigration, partly caused by industrial growth in Europe and agricultural decline in Europe. Remember, Europe is hemmed in; it's relatively small, and at least in 19th century, early 20th century terms, the United States is limitless, right? So the more that industries grow in Europe, and the more that agriculture becomes industrialized, the reverse is happening in Europe. What's happening in the United States? Agricultural workers are being thrown off the land because there isn't enough work for them. If you have a reaping machine, then all of a sudden that replaces 20 guys doing the reaping, and they have to go somewhere else. Okay, so an awful lot of them immigrated. Okay, again, more stats here. Between 1840, if we go back to them, and 1914, when World War I, by the way, halts immigration from Europe, nearly 40 million people emigrated to the United States, and another 20 million moved to other parts of the Western Hemisphere, including Canada, Argentina, Brazil, the Caribbean. We tend to forget about those aspects of immigration. So that's 60 million people moving to the Western Hemisphere. It's an enormous number just from Europe. Okay, and there were great numbers of Chinese, Mexican immigrants coming from the West to the Pacific states and up from Mexico, and a lot of these immigrants they're either pushed off the land or they're pushed out of Europe or pushed out of other places because the economic conditions for them become difficult. But there are also those are what's called push factors. There are also pull factors. Pull factors are ways in which the Western Hemisphere seems attractive to people. Okay, so it seems like maybe you can get land, maybe you can get a house, maybe you can get this and that if you come to the Americas. Okay, so a lot of push and pull factors are very, very important to help explain why there's so much immigration. But what we can't do is we can't automatically assume that all people come as free labor. Now, the slave trade itself had been abolished, right? But what happened for an awful lot of laborers, especially Chinese laborers, especially Mexican laborers, especially Italian laborers and migrants, is that they were signed to long-term contracts by American labor agents who went out to Europe and rounded up people, convinced people to come to the United States, would sign a long-term contract with, just for the sake of argument, say the Ford Motor Company, right? That's not a good example because it doesn't really start roaring to the 20s. But say they sign a long-term labor agreement with Carnegie Steel or Standard Oil or something. Okay, and so those are you're locked into that legally for a long time. So it's not as if you show up in the United States and you can get any job you want. You've already signed up. Okay, and a lot of there's an actual process where people go out. Companies send people over to Europe and other places in the world in order to get laborers. Okay. Now, most Europeans, even in this period of new immigration, come to the United States through Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Not all of them are let in. If you fail a medical examination, if you're a known anarchist, prostitute, otherwise undesirable, you're sent home. Okay, but millions of Americans can trace their ancestry to Ellis Island immigrants. An awful lot of people from this region can trace their ancestry to Ellis Island immigrants. Now, at the same time, Asian, Mexican migrants, as I say, came to the American West through San Francisco, through El Paso. A lot of them end up growing citrus crops in the San Gabriel Valley in California, which explodes in terms of production. And sorry, I can't go very long without throwing in a few stats here. By 1910, 1 out of every 7 people in America was foreign-born. That's the highest percentage in American history. Not descended from foreign, actually foreign-born. Okay, the offensive term that was used at the time was off the boat. It was literally people who were just off the boat. Okay, that's not a term that you want to use when talking about. You don't use that term unless you're referring it to it as a term used by 19th century prejudiced people. Okay, now. Did I just say that? I don't know if I should have said I got my outline here. More than 40% of New York's population was born abroad, and and more than 30% in other major cities like Chicago and Milwaukee, and indeed Pittsburgh. And a lot of these cities retain their immigrant cultures, their immigrant nature, and their immigrant status for a very long time, right? Well into the rest of the 20th century. Now, coming to New York didn't mean, or Boston, didn't mean you necessarily stayed there. A lot of immigrants moved west. Most of them, again, settled in these western, and back then Chicago was considered a western city. Cleveland was a western city. Toledo was a western city. Most of them settle in industrial areas. Some of them get farms, but usually the agricultural immigration movement was, for most people, was before this period. Anyway. Okay, and so I have one more stat here. By 1910, nearly 3/5 of the workers in the 20 leading manufacturing and mining industries in the country were foreign-born. Okay, that's an enormous percentage of people. Okay. Now, what do these new immigrants think about America? Well, in many ways, in many cases, they think of America as a land of freedom. Everyone, in theory, enjoys equality before the law. They could worship as they please. Economic opportunity. They didn't have to deal with their original homelands, their birthlands, oppressive social hierarchies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this was, of course, rhetoric, and a lot of this was untrue. But the most important thing to remember is that an awful lot of people believe this, and for an awful lot of people, it did work. Those things did happen to them, and they were able to make more or less the kind of life they thought they would make in the United States. Now, the other thing is that the government, we know a lot about this because the government actually sent out experts to try to interview as many Europeans and other people as possible to determine why people were coming to the United States. And now, granted, no one is going to say, when they're being interviewed by the American government in Poland, no one's going to say, interviewed by an agent from the American government who's in Poland trying to figure out this stuff. No one's going to say, I want to move to New York to become an anarchist and have a workers' revolution in New York. Obviously that just doesn't. So we have to take with a grain of salt what they say, but an awful lot of them are very, very frank about why they want to go. Okay, and the main impetus seems to be a desire to attain freedom, engage in economic activities that they couldn't engage in Europe anymore, and eradicate, quote, their hopeless poverty. It's a very common phrase in these documents. Some, such as Jews who fled religious persecution in Russia. Okay. And they intended to stay in the United States permanently. Okay, roughly half of the people who come to the United States, the goal is to stay there forever. But the other half, and this is again very clear from these documents and these interviews that are taken, want to move to the United States, earn enough money to come home and buy land. Okay, so Irish immigrants, Mexican immigrants were often called birds of passage because they only stayed briefly in the United States. The idea was you came over here, worked yourself to death for 10 or maybe even 20 years, and then you went home with enough money to buy land and try to live a better life in your homeland. Okay. I remember doing research about this in Irish history, and in some parts of Ireland, it was 50-50. 50% of the people who left came back, right? With more money in their pockets eventually, and were able to improve their lives at home. So it's not a universal case of people wanting to abandon their own cultural backgrounds. They don't want to do that at all. And in fact, the other ways you can see this is that the fact that the new wave of immigrants settled mostly in close-knit ethnic neighborhoods where they worked. Okay? They often had their own businesses, community organizations, continued to speak their own language, published foreign language newspapers, right? Foreign language magazines. In New York, it was as common, and certainly in Pennsylvania, it was as common to find a German language newspaper as to find an English language newspaper. Okay, this is a very, very important factor to remember. People not only use this practice to gain a foothold, right? You could come over and you didn't have to learn English right away because you can more or less go to work straight away and live in a German-speaking area or a Yiddish-speaking area, and gradually become Americanized, right? And it was very, very, very effective. And initially there was very little opposition to this. There was some xenophobia and some hatred and some, the speak English movements and things like that, even that we see today. That comes a little bit later as immigrants sort of expand and move out of these ethnic neighborhoods and rub shoulders more with traditional Anglo-Saxons, and the traditional Anglo-Saxons become resentful of this. The other way you can look at this, and you can still see this particularly in our region, is churches. Okay, churches are very, very central to these new ethnic communities, new ethnic neighborhoods. Okay, one of the first things that immigrants do when they come and they settle in groups in urban areas or near factories or whatever is build a church. Usually build a very big church, right? A very ornate church. And I want to just briefly talk about Braddock, for instance. Braddock is a town in our region, as you know, which was directly in the shadow of Carnegie Steel Mills, made up of overwhelmingly tenement housing and small shotgun shack housing at the time. But in the middle of Braddock, you have 2 or 3 very large, certainly by the time, very ornate, beautiful Russian Orthodox churches, Catholic churches built by these immigrants. Okay, the money doesn't come from Rome. The money doesn't come from Moscow or wherever the center for the Russian Orthodox Church was. It comes from the actual community. So a lot of radicals at the time used to complain that immigrants were coming over and working their tails off, working in these industrial factories, and rather than spending a lot of their money on their own improvement, right? The churches either were convincing them, or the religions were convincing, or they were convincing themselves to build churches. Okay, so you always look at where people spend their money to see where their priorities lie. And lots of people, particularly socialists and stuff like that, would complain that the religion or whatever has this sort of brainwashing hold on people, and that they should be trying to get more doctors into their neighborhoods and things like that. And here they were building these glorious Golden Dome churches in Braddock, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And fortunately, historians since that, when I say radicals and socialists, I'm talking about those at the time. Fortunately, historians since then have been able to analyze these things and see and show that, well, yes, that's possibly true, but it's also very likely that people are doing this genuinely out of faith and genuinely because they want to retain a lot of their ethnic identity. So they're not being bamboozled by the Pope or bamboozled by the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is very, very important to them. And in fact, the critique that historians make of these radicals in the early 19th century is that you're taking away the agency from the people who built these churches by saying that they were the unwitting dupes of the Vatican, or the unwitting dupes of Russian Orthodoxy, or whatever it was. Okay, so it's a very interesting sort of debate going on in American history about how the degree to which either one of those things is true. Okay, now enough talk about Braddock. But although most immigrants earned more in the United States than they could have at home, they faced long hours, low wages, dangerous working conditions, mines, factories, fields. Okay, and a lot of people complain about this, including, and I have a quote here from a Slavic priest, and I don't want to say that this Slavic priest who was just now offering mass in his glorious new church built by poor people, but that's probably what happened. He said, there's a quote here. It says, "My people are not in America; they are under it." Okay, they are performing like human factory machines, right, and not paying attention and not being part of the American dream. They're just part of the American machinery, right? All right, more pictures. I like this picture. This is a 19 photograph by Alfred Stieglitz, who is by far the most interesting and important photographer, American photographer at the time, European American photographer at the time. And this is called The City of Ambition, 1910. What's interesting here to me is that what Stieglitz tried to chronicle was the rise of the skyscraper in New York. Okay, and then this is very interesting because we think of New York, we think of Manhattan, certainly just wall-to-wall skyscrapers, but of course it wasn't always like that. And so what you had were these clumps of skyscrapers that shot up in the early 20th century in I don't want to say isolated, but in clumps in different parts of Manhattan. Okay, so you had Midtown skyscrapers go up and whatever. But they went up in an area that had been low-slung warehouses, factories, tenement buildings, and ordinary homes and things like that. So you had across Manhattan these kind of great big weeds, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but these the way that weeds sort of shoot right up in the middle of your yard. These skyscrapers pop up across Manhattan and provide a sort of image of the contrasts of American life in this period. And Stieglitz was fascinated by this because European cities had not grown this way, and American cities were growing in a very, very modern, of a totally new way that people hadn't seen before, but that he wanted to chronicle. Okay, and we can't go very far in the Progressive era without talking about workers and especially about child labor. And this is a photograph by a man named Lewis Hine, and his mission in life was to chronicle the plight of child laborers. Okay. This is a young spinner in a Vermont cotton factory. What these kids did was they worked these large spinning spool machines which turned raw cotton into thread and then put it onto spools, which then would be sold on to garment manufacturers, textile manufacturers, and this and that. And the child labor was not only cheaper, but children with their smaller hands could more easily manipulate a lot of this fine detail work. And so it was there were lots of reasons why children were dragooned into working in this way, but a lot of people were very shocked by these photographs, quite rightly so, because of the conditions that the workers were in, and that they're packed in these factories. The air is bad. They're breathing a lot of cotton dust, a lot of material fibers, right, which they end up with emphysema and all sorts of other things at a young age and die. And this helped. It's pictures like this that help bring about eventually child labor laws. Okay, so more stats. You know what a stats guy am. Let's look at this rise of the city 1880 to 1920. Okay, notice here, you don't even have to look at the numbers of cities with 100,000 people or more, although that certainly doubles, right? More than doubles. But look at this urban population percentage. This is an enormous change. In 1880, there 20% of the population live in cities. In 1920, 68% of people live in cities. Okay, that's 40 years. That's well within a person's adult life. Okay, that's an enormous change, right? And you see it's kind of gradual, right, in the last few years of the 19th century, but then it really skyrockets in the early 20th century. That's what we're talking about when we talk about urbanization and the rise of the city in the progressive era. Okay, you can see that in stark numbers right there. And I like this illustration called there was a 1912 publication called The New Immigration. And it depicted various types of people entering the United States. And if you zoom in, you can see that these are sort of grouped into ethnic groupings. I think they're all men. But you can see that there are people there are Italians, there are Lithuanians, there are all kinds of people. And of course, the central image is the Statue of Liberty, that the idea is that they're all here because of American promises of freedom. But the reason why I like this image is because, remember what I said a couple lectures ago, people almost always in history, people are paying attention. Okay, stuff isn't happening and they're just passively letting it go by. A lot of people pay attention to what's going on. They want to try to understand changes, right? And so things like the new immigration are ways in which to try to explain that sort of thing. Now, this is not a government publication. This is just a sort of, this wasn't a magazine. This is just a one-off publication, which try to say, this is what's happening. Now, again, they trumpet the American liberty as the attracting factor and sort of imply in other parts of the publication that all these people become Americanized, right? But I think it's an interesting depiction of the new immigration to the United States. Now, I have to have a little complaint here. This is the thing that this drives historians nuts. One of the things that happens in people's analysis at the time, and one of the things that certainly has happened in the decades since these high periods of high immigration, is that people are depicted from their homelands wearing very traditional, very countrified ethnic garments. Okay, and here you see, they don't just show a Lithuanian or a Turk. They have to put them in what they considered Turkish dress or Lithuanian dress or Eastern European dress or Russian dress of the time. And these are artificial pictures. These are artificial depictions. Again, go back to The Godfather Part 2 and watch little Vito Corleone come into Ellis Island. And by the way, his name is changed by the clerks at Ellis Island. That's another myth. That never happened. It's a long story. I'll try to send you a podcast about that. But anyway, in the background, you see all these immigrants showing up at Ellis Island in these ridiculous folk dresses. It looks like the SS European Folk Dancing Society had pulled into New York Harbor and disembarked its contents of people. So you see Dutch people with clogs and the flying nun hats and all kinds of stuff. And the idea is that Francis Ford Coppola tried to say show the immigrant nature of these things. Well, that's not how people dressed when they went traveling. They dressed in ordinary European traveling clothes of that day and age, which is very bland, very ordinary traveling clothes, and they were almost indistinguishable from each other. They didn't show up with, loaves of ethnic bread under their arms and things like that. It's this complete exaggeration for effect. But what happened in Ellis Island is you had, or in other places in New York, you had photographers setting up studios where you would go in and you would say, you go in and you could have your picture taken in the traditional native ethnic folk dress of your region of origin. So a person from Holland could go in to a photographer's studio, and again, some of these were in Ellis Island. You'd have photographers sitting at the sort of after you've passed through the immigration control, that you could actually change into Dutch clothing and have your picture taken, so you could remember what life was like back in Holland that you had left. And they'd take a picture of you as a typical Irishman or a typical Dutch person or a typical Turk or a typical Slovak, whatever it was, dressed up in these, I don't want to say get-ups because that sounds insulting, but dressed up in overwhelming ethnic clothing that you may not have ever worn in your life. Okay? So this is a very, very common thing in depictions of immigrants in American culture, and it's very artificial. Okay, very, very artificial. And believe me, if you ever want to tire of the sound of my voice, ask me about this dressing up, this sort of Halloween dressing up of immigrants in the United States. Now, some people did obviously wear their traditional clothing, particularly Chinese laborers coming from China into the West Coast. But for the most part, certainly European people came over mostly all dressed looking the same. That's what drives me nuts about, for instance, The Godfather Part 2 and other movies like that. The completely impractical clothes that people show up with in those movies just makes me crazy. Anywho, here's an immigrant from Mexico, 1912, arriving in Mexico across the border in a cart drawn by a donkey, which is, we forget, because of the Ellis Island focus, we tend to forget about these immigrants from Mexico and how common this was and how frequent this was. Okay. Again, let me show you some more stats. This is immigrants and their children as percentages of the population in 10 major cities in the United States. Okay. These are enormous. Now, remember, immigrants are people not with immigrant backgrounds, but they are literally immigrants who have arrived. They were born in foreign countries. Okay, so they're immigrants. Their children are what's called first-generation Americans. Okay, so my great-grandfather was an immigrant. My great-grandfather, my great-grandparents on both of my maternal and paternal sides were immigrants, and their children were first-generation Americans. So my great-grandfather, sorry, I shouldn't say that. My great-grandfather, well, anyway, you see what I'm saying. Remember this old, and again, not insulting phrase, off the boat. The immigrants are the people who just arrived, and then their children. So the immigrant generation and the first generation, you see enormous percentages, 76% in New York. Pittsburgh is even 59%. Now, you can see that it declines somewhat as it goes west, right? Now, Los Angeles and Seattle are a little bit of outliers here because they don't have quite the Chinese immigration that San Francisco has, but these are significant percentages. Okay, still significant percentages. Okay, so this is a big change in American life. Now, again, I love these cultural things because they show us an awful lot about what people thought was going on in the United States. So this is a piece of sheet music from a song called "Long Live the Land of the Free," published in 1911, and it's depicted at Jewish immigrants. You notice the Hebrew writing at the top, okay? It celebrates the United States as the land of the free in both languages. Okay. Now, obviously, there's Lady Liberty there on the left, the eagle, a lot of American symbolism, a lot of American iconography here. This is very, 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 very common. You see this with all kinds of languages. Sheet music with German, sheet music in French, sheet music, especially in Italian, and on and on and on. But then the title of the song is almost always in English. Okay. And there were just enormous numbers of these songs written, published, sang, performed in this period, and especially in what became known as the vaudeville tradition, okay? The music hall tradition, vaudeville tradition. Okay, now let me talk about mass consumption society, which is an extremely important part of this period. I've been talking about immigration. Maybe not for too long. Can't talk about immigration for too long because it's just so extremely important. But I do tend to get on these rolls. So let me talk about this major change, because this also has to do with cities. Cities were also the birthplace of mass consumption society, of a mass consumption society, and this helps give a new meaning to American freedom. Okay. The promise of American life had always, in part resided in the enjoyment of goods that in other nations were only really available to wealthy people. Okay, but really only in the progressive era did large downtown department stores, like I talked about in that depiction of the Bowery. Well, no, that's not large downtown department stores in the Bowery, but chain stores in cities, retail mail order houses for rural residents to make these goods accessible to people in various parts of the country, for stuff that was produced in American factories. I talked early on in my lecture about the West, how important the Sears catalog was. Well, this is the same thing that's going on. Okay. A lot of these goods include, again, sewing machines are a very big deal. Washing machines are a huge deal, especially electric ones when they eventually come out. Vacuum cleaners, record players, right? All the sort of things that are so easily bought on Amazon nowadays were all sort of new, but all mass-produced and became more widely available to people than ever before. Okay? Now, not everybody could get these things. Our wages were low. Income was very unequally distributed. There was a lot of poverty, especially in the South. Okay, so the consumer society is limited. Consumption of consumer goods is limited before World War II, but it really starts its takeoff in the progressive era, and it was tied very, very closely to ideas of American freedom. Okay. Modern capitalism provides this abundance, and you are free as an American to take part in it. This also includes leisure activities. Don't get me wrong, it's not just stuff, but people were able to go to amusement parks, they were able to go to dance halls, the theaters. These things attracted very large crowds. And again, the most popular form of mass entertainment was vaudeville, which was live theater, and it had it's like a variety show. Well, maybe you don't know what variety shows are anymore. Well, it's a variety show acted out on the stage. So it would be short acts, some singing, some dancing, some comedy routines, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them lasting 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then they move on to something else. Very, very, very popular. Okay. And of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning, motion pictures became a mass phenomenon. Okay. Even working class people could often afford the Nickelodeons, the 5-cent movie houses, right? So this is a consumption society. Consumer society is an extremely important development in this period. Okay. The other thing that happens is traditional gender roles changed dramatically. Okay. Women were, newly visible in public spaces such as workplaces, stores, sites of entertainment. More and more women work for wages. More and more women work in factories. And although black and immigrant women were still confined to low-paid, low-skilled jobs, native-born white women, I should say, quickly found expanding opportunities in white-collar work, secretaries and offices. Remember, the rise of banking means the rise of paperwork. So there's a huge demand for secretarial workers. Okay, and that really changes the face of the workplace. Women workers weren't just young unmarried white women and adult black women. By 1920, of the 8 million women working for wages, a quarter of them were married and living with their husbands. So the idea, and you may have heard this again from your great-grandparents or grandparents, is that, you went off to the city, a woman would go off to the city to get a job in an office building and find a husband, and then come home and raise a family. Well, that certainly happened, but what was almost just as common was women working in the cities and then staying working after they got married. And these working women became symbols of female emancipation. They showed economic independence for men. They were moving beyond their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Right? They they wanted to participate in the new mass consumer society, and many women earned money independently of their families. Now, sometimes this causes great friction, right? Especially in immigrant families who want to maintain their traditional cultural practices under a constant threat of the new American ways of life. But it is, again, a very dynamic and very changing society. Ooh, more stats. I'm sorry that this is going on so long, but this is the percentage of women aged 14 years or older in the labor force. Okay, again, let's look at the number. Every number increases here. Every number, including married women. Right? Now, this isn't an enormous jump like it is in some of the other stats we've seen, but the married women percentage is a very strong jump. Okay, so things are really, really changing. Wage working is a really, really important aspect of this period. For instance, here are women working at a shoe factory. Okay, this is factory work. This is not assembly line work. They're actually piece work. And this is a very, very common thing in big cities, especially New York, Chicago, and all kinds of other places become big shoe manufacturing centers because shoes actually become more important. They're worn out more quickly in the industrial era, in the progressive era, because people are moving around a lot more, and you often need different types of shoes for different types of things that you do during the day. Okay. Obviously, there were critiques of this. Right? This is a drawing from John Sloan from the radical magazine The Masses, and it's called "The Return from Toil," and it depicts women not as working women, not as downtrodden, right, but as independent-minded and stylish, confident people coming back from work, right? But who were taking their wages and turning them into effectively ways to improve their lot, but also ways to try to improve the condition of women in American life. You know what? This was gonna be 2 lectures, but I think I'm gonna make it 3 because I've got so much more to talk about. So I'm gonna end this lecture here and start talking about Fordism next, and then eventually get to feminism and the rise of the women's political power in the 19th century. So I think an hour of listening to me is enough about the progressive period. So this is going to be turned into a 3-lecture module rather than 2-lecture module. So I'll talk to you a little bit later.